Hello and welcome to the Game Lore Archives. I'm Daniel.
And I'm Joe.
Today we're discussing one of my favourite PlayStation games of last year, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. This game first caught many people's attention due to its incredible graphics. On top of that, the story it tells is beautifully in depth, if not a little bit harrowing. Before we go into it though, if you enjoy our content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for weekly videos and maybe check out the Patreon page as well. Now, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice tells its story less like an action game and more akin to a walking simulator, so the story can be a little hard to follow. And so we thought it would be, a good idea to discuss our interpretation of the game's events. Obviously, there is a spoiler warning attached to this episode, and also this game is really, really dark at times, featuring some pretty grim realities based not only on real-world history, but also on current mental illnesses. So if you find either of these topics disturbing, then please proceed with caution.
Like most walking simulators, this game's story doesn't focus much on what's actually happening in the game, but is largely about what's happening in our protagonist, Senua's, past. Senua is a young Pict warrior. The Picts were a large formation of tribes found in both northern and eastern Scotland, who had a similar language and culture to the Celts. With this game being set so long ago in Earth's history, it's only recently that people have begun to accept and understand mental health conditions and the implications associated with them. In fact, the current level of awareness is still relatively new, and there is often still a negative stigma surrounding the subject. However, back in Senua's time, there would have been next to no understanding of mental health issues at all.
To fully understand Senua's story, we need to explore her childhood. Senua's mother is a priestess named Galena.
And her father is a druid named Zimbel.
Galena suffers from psychosis. Psychosis is a symptom which is associated with serious mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Symptoms of psychosis can range. There's a large variety, but they can include difficulty concentrating, depression, anxiety, delusions, and hallucinations. Now, a hallucination, for those who don't quite know, is defined as the perception of an object or an event in the absence of any external stimulus. Essentially, this means that you sense things that don't exist outside of the individual's mind. Generally, people think of hallucinations as you seeing things, although actually audiological hallucinations, which means you hear things in your head, is the most common kind of hallucination among those who have suffered from psychosis. However, symptoms can affect any or all of people's five senses, so including taste, touch, anything like that.
Galena's psychosis presented itself as auditory hallucinations. Now, without the current knowledge of mental health issues, Galena believed these were the voices of the spirit world communicating with her. However, her husband Zimbel had a different opinion. He believed that Galena was cursed and that hearing spirits was an ability which defied the gods themselves. He called her condition her curse, the darkness.
Eventually, Zimbel's fear of this curse reached its apex when Senua is just 5 years old, and he led a mob and burned Galena alive in front of Senua as a sacrifice to appease the gods.
Some A-star husband material right there.
See, the issue with his actions is that it just spreads the problem. Modern research suggests that while mental health issues aren't strictly hereditary, it is more likely to affect you if it runs in the family. And a very, very common precursor to mental health disorders is experiencing large traumas in your early years, like witnessing your mother being murdered by your father would definitely class as a childhood trauma. And it's of no surprise then that witnessing her mother burn caused something to snap in Senua's mind, and she begins to show signs of psychosis.
Now, sometimes when we witness horrific things, our mind subconsciously represses the memory and replaces it with something we can cope with as some kind like a defense mechanism.
And this is exactly what happened to Senua, who forgot what she had witnessed and began to believe that her mum had committed suicide.
But just because Senua doesn't consciously remember her mother's execution, her subconscious does, and she was understandably affected. Zimble soon realises that Senua is displaying symptoms much like Galena and believes that the curse must have been passed to her. However, he doesn't seem to have the heart to kill her outright, as she's his daughter, so instead uses old religious methods to quote-unquote cure her curse.
Things like beating her, performing rituals on her and isolating her from the rest of the tribe, which seems horrific, and it is, but again, as we said earlier, it's important to remember that mental health wouldn't have been a thing. If you see things, it would be witchcraft or a curse, or it generally would, because people didn't even consider that the mind could be ill.
So, after the abuse, he would then manipulate the young Senua by acting like a nurturing parent that's just trying to do what's best for her, which I suppose he was trying to.
Maybe, but my argument is, right, okay, he's trying to do his best, maybe. Maybe don't burn someone to a crisp.
Well, yeah.
This is where the whole good guy thing falls down, so I do think that he's just not great.
Yeah.
But time differences, maybe he was just trying to do his best. We don't know.
Anyway, as Senua grew up, Zimble only allowed her to leave the house to gather herbs or run small, simple errands for him. During one of these errands, Senua saw one of the tribe's warriors named Dillian practicing his sword techniques. Senna was fascinated by them and began to mimic them, teaching herself the basics of sword fighting by copying Dillian. One day, Dillian saw what she was doing and came to talk to her, impressed with her skill despite the complete lack of training. He suggests that she takes warrior trials and that she becomes a warrior for the tribe herself. Senua takes his advice and managing to become a warrior herself. During this time, Dillian and her fall in love until they decide to move in together.
I guess Senua wanted to see some other sword techniques.
It's appalling.
Hey, I wrote this episode. It has puns, and you'll all like it.
Senua went to her father, who had never agreed with the relationship, to tell him the news. Zimble is furious, screaming at Senua and hitting her to the floor, saying that she's not only defying his wishes, but that of the gods as well, and that her curse would ruin the entire tribe. Senua gains the strength to overcome her fear of her father, draws her sword, and holds him at bay so that she can leave.
And life is good for a while, until one day a group of warriors,
including Senua and Dillian,
leave the village on a mission. When they return from their mission, the village has been hit by the plague. Now, either one of the warriors in Senua's group contracts the plague while they're out and brings it back to the village, or the plague has already infected the population when they return. To be honest, I can't find the exact right answer. It's between those two. But regardless of exactly what happened, the tribe's members are decimated.
In the real world, when plague hit the UK, 60% of the population was killed.
And unfortunately, this included the death of the tribe's chief, which was Dillian's father. The survivors are obviously heartbroken and angry, and as people do, they start looking for something to blame, and remember Zimble's words about Senua's curse causing the tribe ruin, so they begin to blame her. And so her psychosis flares up, and she suffers from a very real visual hallucination where Dillian is also blaming her, screaming that it's all her fault, and it causes her to flee the village into the forest to not spread the curse as such.
Psychosis is often associated with heightened negative emotions, so her guilt and fear were most likely the catalyst for this hallucination.
Dillian does manage to find Senua, and he tells her that he doesn't blame her at all and never would. However, Senua has convinced herself that if she stays in the village, the curse will spread to Dillian or lead to more deaths, so she decides to stay in the forest to battle her darkness alone.
Senua stays in the wilderness for quite some time. She nearly dies, but survives until one day where she meets a badly wounded, half-burnt man named Druth from another Pictish clan. Druth is a smart man and is able to speak both locally and to the Vikings. Because of this, he often acts as an interpreter, preventing bloodshed where possible. This didn't last though, and he was eventually kidnapped by the Vikings. The Norsemen tortured Druth until they forced him to lead them to their other Pictish villages. He escaped, but the attempt left him clinging to life. Senua befriends Druth and sits with him as he dies. While she's there, he regales her with stories, myths and legends of Norse mythology, including stories of runestones. Anyone else in Senua's shoes would have passed Druth off as crazy or known that these were just stories, but Senua took these tales as facts, no matter how embellished, and she viewed these Norsemen as just as real as her darkness. As he died, Druth vowed that he would repay Senua's kindness by looking down on her from the afterlife.
As he dies, Senua hurries back to her village, hoping they're safe from the Vikings. However, when she returns, she finds devastation. The Vikings have ransacked the village and killed everyone. Dillion has been sacrificed using the Blood Eagle ritual, a particularly brutal method of execution.
Blood Eagle execution is performed by lying the victim face down and severing their ribs from their spine using a sharp tool. The victim's lungs are then pulled through the opening to create a pair of wings. Dillion was then put on show for all of the village to see.
Lovely.
It's attractive.
Yeah, so this horrific sight and the loss of loved ones triggers a severe psychotic episode, and Senua's mind creates a story that she can understand and cope with. And the story combines the horrors that she's seen in her village, her curse being the results of an evil being, and the savage stories of Norse mythology that she was told about from Druth. And she creates this story is that Hela is the one that cursed her with the darkness.
Hela rules over Helheim, the Norse version of Hell.
And she also believes that Dillion was sacrificed to her. So Senua sets off to find Helheim to confront Hela, taking Dillion's head with her as she believes that this is where the soul resides, in hope that she can save him and bring him back.
And this is where the game begins. We see the opening shots of Senua sailing to where she believes Helheim is.
And near the beginning, she also begins to hear Druth's voice ring through her head, more than likely because Druth said, out of kindness, that he'd look down from her from the afterlife. Again, her psychosis probably fed into that and thought he meant it almost literally, and so the story feeds in that he's literally there helping her.
And although this is what the gameplay shows us is happening, it's actually where events are most unclear, as what we see in the game is not technically real. All the horrors are a result of Senua's psychosis, making her perceive the world as a twisted and horrific hellscape. Due to gameplay not being an accurate representation of true events, we can't say with 100% certainty what really happens. One theory is that Senua never left her village. She's frozen in terror, surrounded by the sight of her family and friends butchered around her, and that the entire game takes place in her mind as she tries to make sense of the destruction around her.
The second theory is similar. It still didn't really happen, but that Senua really did travel to another island, believing that Helheim was located there. The island that she travels to is occupied by Vikings, but instead of just seeing these Norsemen as what they really are, just normal people that are muscly and warriors, she sees them as amplified versions of how they appear in the stories she's heard. Huge men with huge axes with skulls adorning their heads. One of the later bosses, the fearsome Venrir, is probably something like a war dog or a wild bear, but she perceives it to be a big monster. And whenever she finds a deer, her psychosis tells her that it's locked by ancient magic, and she doesn't even attempt to touch the door before she's unlocked it. Everyone else would have just seen a normal door where they would just walk through without a problem. She also sees lore stones, which Druth told her about, the rune stones, and she's reminded of Druth's stories, and so they echo throughout her mind, reminding her that this is how the world should be according to him. The voices she hears throughout the game often belittle her, probably due to her own self-doubt. The loudest voice of them all is the shadow, a focal point of her inner darkness. And during the game, Senua remembers the truth about her mother's death and what her father did. And the shadow is revealed to be a manifestation of her father, hearing his voice taunt her right until the very end.
It may not seem like it, but the short time Senua spends with Druth was critical in Senua's perception of reality. She had never met him or heard his stories. Her mind would have probably established a very different reality for her, completely void of Norse gods and runestones. It may appear strange that Druth is so important to Senua, being as they only knew each other for a very short period of time, but really he's probably one of the only people Senua felt close to. Her mother would have understood her condition, but she was killed before it had fully manifested. Dillion was understanding and loved her, but couldn't fully understand what she was going through. Druth, however, had his own demons, and so Senua probably felt a close kinship with him.
Ultimately, there was no Hela or Helheim. The demonic Vikings either didn't exist at all or were just normal Vikings. Every voice she hears, ghost she sees, and rune blocking a door are just manifestations of her mind, trying to come to terms with Dillion's death in a time when people didn't know mental health issues existed. Without that knowledge, she would have believed that everything she experienced was real. Finally, at the end of the game, Senua is attacked by endless waves of enemies, shadowed by Hela looming over her, until eventually Senua is struck down and defeated, and all enemies vanish. And Hela shrinks down to Senua's side and approaches slowly. And it's these things of disappearing and shrinking that Senua begins to realise that none of this is real, but she desperately clings to the fantasy that Dillion can be brought back and saved, and so she begs Hela to trade her own soul for his.
Hela doesn't respond at all, and so Senua begs for death, saying she has nothing left.
And Hela obliges, picking up Senua's weapon and stabbing her with it, and then picks up Dillion's skull and throws it away.
But Hela was never there, and so could not have killed Senua. We next see Senua in Hela's place, a metaphor showing the viewer that Senua's strongest opponent was herself and her own inner demons. By accepting Dillion is gone forever, she can begin to move on and come to terms with his death. Some people believe that this means that she has rid herself of psychosis. However, the reality is she probably would never be rid of the visions, but she can rid herself of the control it has over her and live at peace with her visions. And that's the end of Senua's tale. For those interested in history, after the Vikings invade the Picts,
which is Senua's tribe,
they would join the Scots, forming the now Kingdom of Scotland. And now we'd love to hear from you. How did you interpret the game? Did you agree with what we said? If not, let us know why not. Just pop it in the comments and we'll see you next week.
And just before we go, you may notice that we only gave a very brief overview of psychosis and how it affects people. And it's very unlike us, as we do our best to be as thorough as possible with pretty much every topic that we even touch upon. I think when discussing Khajiit for Elder Scrolls, we even went into cat penises.
Yeah, we did.
However, with this kind of topic, I feel like we should leave it to someone a little bit better qualified. After all, we're literally a couple of nerds that enjoy talking about video games. We know that psychosis is very real and very serious illness that affects a lot of people. And I don't want to be someone that blunders in and says something inaccurate and accidentally hurting people or offending them, as that's not what we're trying to do. So if you want to learn more about psychosis itself, I have left a link in the description. This page also has some useful contact information. So if you're struggling with any, mental health issues, or you know anyone that is, maybe check it out and just make sure that, we're keeping everyone safe and happy. After all, we're trying to make, you guys a community. And so we want you all safe and healthy.